Well, hi, I'm Dr. Ryan, Dr. Carly Ryan. I am a pediatrician here in Savannah, Georgia, born and raised in Savannah. And I actually am a pediatrician at Pediatric Associates of Savannah. Fun fact, I actually grew up a patient of the practice seeing Dr. Shelley, and I've been able to come back and start practicing medicine here as well. We have 3 offices in Wilmington Island, Savannah, and Pooler, and I'm here to answer some questions that y'all submitted through Southern Mamas and about just kind of general pediatric care and other questions that you might have as a new mom. So we'll go ahead and get started. First question that we have is, what are signs of dairy allergies in infants? And so it can kind of be a wide variety of symptoms. A lot of parents, when they hear dairy allergy, think lactose intolerance, and that's usually something that presents actually later in childhood, not necessarily as a baby. When you hear dairy allergy in infants, we're actually talking about milk protein allergies. You have an allergy to an actual dairy protein that's found within milk in moms that are breastfeeding who are taking in dairy, or sometimes even in formula, they'll have the dairy proteins that the babies can be allergic to. So things that we look out for as pediatricians that tell us that your baby might be having a dairy allergy or milk protein allergy. One of the first things we'll ask is if you're seeing any blood in your baby's poop. Usually it's not gross, lots of blood. That's a lot more concerning. These allergies can cause some irritation of the stomach lining that causes little specks of blood that you'll notice in your baby's poop. So if you ever start seeing that, that's something that you should obviously bring up to your pediatrician, and that will usually be something we ask you. And then sometimes you can also have really bad reflux and fussiness. One of the things that we will recommend in babies who seem to be a little bit more fussy than normal or have a little bit more painful spitting up than normal is if you're breastfeeding, we'll ask you to try and take dairy out of your diet, or we might even try a more simplified formula for your child to see if maybe we remove these milk proteins, that if the fussiness improves. And then sometimes, although it's kind of rare to see this without any of the other symptoms, there's a rash that can develop with babies if they have a milk protein allergy as well. So always, if you see any of those signs, it's something good to bring up to your pediatrician and discuss a milk protein allergy. The second question we have is, what age should you start swim lessons? So being in Savannah around the coast, swim lessons are a very, very important part of safety for children growing up around here and anywhere really that they have access to water. So usually you should start swim lessons between the ages of 1 and 4, definitely usually by 4. But you can't start them as early as 1. Just because you start swim lessons does not make children drown proof. That means that just because they have completed their swim lessons and they have graduated from the classes, that mean that they go into a pool or water or on the beach unsupervised. Things you want to look for when looking for swim lessons is a licensed swim instructor, swim instructor. You want to have good safety habits. So they have enough people there. If you are in a multiple swim group class, enough instructors there for each child to make sure they're safe. You want to make sure that you're having multiple lessons. One lesson does not teach your child how to swim just from a 30-minute or a 60-minute class. And then all kids under 4, and even probably over 4 as well, but definitely under 4, even if they've completed some lessons, we still encourage having what we call touch supervision. And that means that you are close enough to your child at all times when they're around water that you can actually touch them and make sure that they are safe. God forbid something happens if they start drowning. But kids, even over 4, if they have some lessons, everyone should always be supervising their children to make sure that they're safe around water. The next question is, what age should I switch to a toddler bed? So there are a couple different answers here. The first one is obviously if your child is starting to climb out of their crib. If that's happening, I think they're trying to tell you, Mom, Dad, put me in a regular bed. And that's just for safety, because if they're climbing out, you want to make sure they're not going to be falling from that height. And it tells you that I think that they're ready for that next milestone. You also want to be putting them in a toddler bed if you're starting to potty train, because if they need to get up and go potty during the night, seeing stuck in a crib is not going to be conducive to continuing to learn how to potty train. when they actually outweigh or they've outgrown the crib safety weights. So a lot of cribs usually might be able to handle 30, 35 pounds. And so usually once they start growing outside of that weight limit is a good time to start switching to the toddler bed. And then the lastly one is if you are lucky enough to have another baby on the way while you already have a baby in the crib, that baby might need to be pushed out to a toddler bed so you can use that crib for your new baby that's on the way. The next question is, what age should my baby be sleeping through the night? So this is a tough question, and a question that some parents sometimes don't love the answer to, but sleeping through the night for a baby is different than compared to adults. So we get 8, if we're lucky, 10, 12 hours of sleep at night. That never happens if you're a parent. But babies sleeping through the night is actually about 6 hours, or sometimes if you're lucky, 8 hours. And that usually happens when the babies are about 3 months old. You should be expecting, though, your baby by the time they're 6 months old should definitely be hitting that 6 to 8 month mark. If you find that your baby is still waking at night or having problems sleeping or crying out, that's something to always bring up with your pediatrician to see if there could be anything else at play that could be keeping them from sleeping through the night. The next question, how do I know if my baby is crying too much, and how do I know when I should see a doctor for excessive crying? So I give all of my parents a 2-week talk. When they come in for their 2-week visit with me, I try and warn them that we're going into the period of purple crying. And purple crying is a real thing. It's usually like when the baby cries so hard, their face turns purple and you're like, oh dear God, there's something wrong with my child. But it's actually because your baby's brain is turning on, that the nerves are starting to connect, and you're going from this cute little baby that sleeps all the time to this little baby that's starting to wake up and is crying more often. This purple crying usually happens in the evening hours, like when you'd be getting home from work, and can last for a few hours, most often between 6 p.m. and almost midnight. So things that you want to make sure is that your baby's not hungry, because they go through a lot of growth spurts during this time. You want to check them out physically, make sure that physically they look okay. And if neither of those things are the case, you can usually kind of assume that it's that period of purple crying. It usually peaks between 6 and 8 weeks of life and then slowly starts to get better after that. Colic is something different, though. The period of purple crying is usually just a little bit of fussiness in the evening hours for, a couple of hours. You can usually calm them down. Colic is you have 3 hours of crying a day, anytime during the day. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the evening hours, for more than 3 days a week, for more than 3 weeks at a time. So colic babies usually are a little bit more fussy. It seems like they're on the period of purple crying on steroids. Again, if you ever find that your baby is having poor feeding, if they are just not eating well, if they're having vomiting, diarrhea, if the cry sounds off, like if you feel like, your baby's cries, they have different cries for different needs, but if the baby's cry sounds different, more high pitched, kind of more weak, those are reasons to be calling your pediatrician, as well as for any signs of respiratory distress. They're breathing harder, they're breathing faster. If they're lethargic, they won't wake up for you. If they're having a fever, anything over 100.4 and babies under 2 months is an emergency, and you should be calling your pediatrician. The next question is, should I be giving my baby vitamin supplements? So all breastfed babies, at least for the first 6 months of life, should be having 400 international units of vitamin D. Your breast milk is amazing. It gives your baby almost everything that they need, but it doesn't quite give them enough vitamin D, and they use that to have their bones grow like they should. So most babies that are solely breastfed should be on vitamin D every day until at least 6 months. There are some premature babies, if they're born super early, that leave the NICU and they have to be on a multivitamin with iron in it just because they need those extra supplements. But most children probably don't need to be on a multivitamin until they're about 1 year old and they're starting to switch to whole milk and just a regular food-based diet, because that's usually about the age where you might start seeing some picky eating. So I always think it's wise to have babies on a multivitamin after they turn 1 year old. Next questions, how often should I be sterilizing my baby's bottles and pacifiers? So I would say at least once a week. There are 2 different ways that you can do it. You can be fancy and buy a baby sterilizer bottle, kind of a machine. I will say I had one of those. And thank you for whoever gave that to me at my baby baby shower, but I ended up actually just doing the easier method of just boiling the baby bottles, nipples, and pacifiers and boiling water for 5 minutes once a week. It was just much easier. It took 5 minutes out of my day. I didn't have to worry about setting up the machine, but whichever way you would prefer to do it, if you trust the machine over your pot of boiling water, then I would do it probably once a week. And that's just to avoid things like thrush and bacteria getting in the bottles and pacifiers. Next question, what food and drinks should I avoid while breastfeeding? So this is a tricky question. There's a lot of foods and drinks that I feel like are kind of baby dependent. The number one thing that I think moms want to know is like, when can I have an alcoholic beverage after I give birth or while I'm breastfeeding? So it is safe to have a glass of wine while you're breastfeeding, but it's usually recommended that you actually have that glass of wine directly after a feeding, when your baby won't be feeding anytime soon. Your body resorbs the alcohol from your breast milk just like it does your body. So if you're feeling the effects from the alcohol still, that means that it's likely still in your breast milk, and you should just pump and dump and get rid of that. You should not give your baby. You can also buy little strips, alcohol strips, where you can test your breast milk to see if it is showing that there are signs of alcohol in it, if you should feed your baby, or if you should, again, pump and dump. Foods are a little bit more tricky. Most of the time, I'm advising parents on what foods to avoid based on their baby's fussiness and gassiness. I will say, as far as harm and things that transfer into the milk goes, very little, honestly, from food perspective, but it's more so like what you eat, it can affect your baby. So what makes you gassy will make your baby gassy. What can upset your tummy and exacerbate your own reflux can do the same thing for your child. So I found very quickly that garlic, onions, cabbage, spicy foods, anything leafy, made my baby very gassy and upset. So for the amount of time that we were breastfeeding, we had no garlic, onions, leafy vegetables, or spicy food in our house. And my husband was not very excited about that. But it's what I noticed, that when I would eat those things, Ruthie would seem to be a little bit more upset with her tummy after I would eat those things. So I started to avoid, and I would like keep a log of, well, she seemed fussy that night. What did I have that day? And I would try and avoid those things from there on out. The next question, how do I know if my toddler is eating too much or too little? How much should I be increasing the amount of food she eats as she grows? So toddlers are stubborn when it comes to foods. If you are lucky and you have a toddler who eats everything, I'm very jealous of you. Picky eaters are a struggle. So the biggest thing you want to make sure is that you're following the weight gain with your pediatrician. If you have concerns that your child is not eating enough, or concerns that, they just don't, they're still in their 12-month-old clothes, but they're almost 2, like that's concerning. And you should be following the weight with your pediatrician, because we track it basically overall as a curve. You can't just take one point in time and say, okay, your child is doing well from here, eating too much, eating too little. We need to track it over time. But the biggest thing with toddlers is just trying to get a well-rounded diet in there. If you do have a picky eater, again, like we talked about, multivitamins is a great way to make sure that they're getting the vitamins and supplements that they need. But offering a variety of things with each mealtime. They may not want to try everything you put in front of them every single time. It usually takes about 20 times of offering a food before your child will even consider trying it. Not like picking it up saying, oh, what's this? I'll try this 20 times and then I decide I like it. It's 20 times you're putting it in front of their face before they'll pick it up and consider putting it in their mouth. So I usually tell parents that you want to be more stubborn than your child is. You're not a short order cook. Whatever you have for dinner that night is what your child should have for dinner for that night. And then if they decide that they're not going to eat a meal or a dinner or lunch or anything like that, they get the same kind of snack every single day. So they do not get a separate meal of chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. They might get a peanut butter and jelly before they go to bed, so they have something on their tummy. But the way you know is if they're eating too little or too much is by following their growth curve along with your pediatrician. What are the signs of postpartum depression? So it is hard to identify whether you were just exhausted from having a newborn or having true postpartum depression. Postpartum depression, and again, that you might be feeling this way even if you're a new mom, because the baby blues is a real thing and actually quite more common than you believe. But things that you want to be looking for within yourself is, are you feeling sad, depressed, like as the name says? Do you feel overwhelmed all the time? Do you feel like you just can't get on top of things, that things are just building up? Do you unnecessarily put blame on yourself for when things go wrong, even if it's completely out of your control? And the big one is, do you feel like you would be better off not being here anymore? And so if you feel like you're answering yes to those questions, you should reach out to your pediatrician, but more importantly, you should be reaching out to your OBGYN as well, because they're there to help you. And taking care of your baby, of course, is important, but it's hard to do a good job at that if you're not keeping yourself well as well. So every time you come in, basically during the newborn period, we always have moms fill out a questionnaire, kind of just gauging their feelings, emotions, seeing how they're doing. And if we start sensing that there might be some postpartum depression, we usually will talk with the parents and tell them that we think you should reach out to your OB and just kind of check in and make sure they have a good support system. And then lastly, what are alarming signs in my baby that I need to see my pediatrician immediately about? So this is a disclosure that this will not be necessarily all inclusive. So just because I don't have anything on this list does not mean that you shouldn't call your pediatrician. You can call us for anything. That is why we signed up to be a general pediatrician, is to answer all of your questions that you may have. But the big ones that we look for are, I mentioned earlier, fever over 100.4, or even being too cold. So less than 96.5 when you take a temperature rectally in your baby. Those are signs of an emergency and that your baby could have an infection. So anything under 96.5 or over 100.4 in babies less than 2 months are always alarming. Then you should be calling us immediately. Any kind of altered mental status. So that can go both ways. Your baby could be so irritable that you can never get them to calm down, constantly crying. There's nothing, pacifiers, swaddling, walking around, patting their bottom, nothing will calm them down. Usually that's an alarming sign. And also the other way of where they won't wake up for anything. They're lethargic, genuinely lethargic, where you pick them up and they are just not waking up. You strip them down, mess with their toes, and they're just not waking up for anything. You should be calling us immediately. Poor feeding is usually a sign that kids aren't feeling well in babies and in toddlers and children. The first thing that usually kind of tells us that something's not right is that they drop off on their eating or feeding. So if you start noticing that your baby or your toddler has just started refusing feeds, not wanting to eat, and now you're starting to see that they're not drinking and not making good wet diapers or leading towards dehydration, you should be calling us to have them come in, check out, make sure that there's no infection or anything else that could be going on that we're missing. And then respiratory distress is always something that we encourage parents to either call us or even take your child straight to the ER for. If they are breathing harder, if they're breathing faster, if you can see their collarbone because they're sucking in so much, or their individual ribs because they're sucking in so much to breathe to try and get air, that's something that we should be seeing or going straight to the ER for. And lastly, I think this one's hard. Rashes are hard because rashes, I swear, are due to 10,000 different things. But ones that we want to know about for sure are if you start seeing any vesicles, so they look like little blistered fluid-filled blisters or something that we want to know about. Rashes that are red, hot, swollen, those are usually a sign of like an infection of the skin that they would probably need antibiotics for, or even possibly have to have drained if it's an abscess. So those are things that you don't want to sit on and wait, that we would want you to call about so we can get you in here as soon as we can. Well, I believe those are all the answers to the questions. If y'all have anything else, I think some of our other pediatricians from the practice are going to be hopping on throughout the months to try and answer any more questions that y'all may have. So I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much, Southern Mamas, for having me.